Well, we're now joined by John Parisella. He is the former Chief of Staff to the former Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa at the time when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister. You know, John, so much has already been shared by many Quebecers about Brian Mulroney, but from someone who had a front row seat to all of this history, how important was Brian Mulroney to Quebec and to Canada?
I think he's one of the most significant Prime Ministers for Quebec. He took over after the breakdown on the constitutional talks that occurred, and Quebec did not sign on to the 1982 Constitution. So he tried to reconciliate, which ended up with Meech Lake, which didn't pass. And then we went to the next phase of Charlottetown. That also didn't pass. But Brian Mulroney was a real strong ally of reconciling Quebec with the rest of the country. So in many ways, as Canadian Prime Minister, he essentially saw Canada through the eyes of a Quebecer. He understood the need for reconciliation. So I saw a man who had vision, I saw a man who had courage, and I saw a man who had resilience and a person who never gave up. So as much as he did a lot of important things, fighting apartheid, getting free trade, and opening the door to the acid rain deal, for Quebec he remains a person that tried to really make it work, make our federation work.
And I think you get a sense of that because ever since his death was announced, just about every political program in the province, popular programs, they are talking about the contribution and just how important Brian Mulroney was to Quebec. How well loved is he in the province, would you say?
I think he's well loved, well respected. The human side of Brian Mulroney is seen by so many people who have either connected with him or he stayed in touch with. His family is very central to who he is as a person. So I think to a lot of Quebecers, he's seen very much with that human touch. But from the point of view of a prime minister who had courage to make change, he's also seen as a guy who was not afraid to make change and not always popular in the process of making change. So he's seen as a man of vision and a man of courage as well.
You say not necessarily popular as one is making change, and there is this real sense of that because I remember certainly being very young watching all of this unfold at the time, and a lot of people were very critical of Brian Mulroney. A lot of people were not happy with his constitutional stance, but when you look at where we stand right now as a country, his legacy is there.
Oh, very much so. When you you take a stand, sometimes you'll have people who will be with you and people who will be against you. So obviously on free trade it was not unanimous, but he won the battle. On the question of reconciliation with Quebec, again there was a division, and we saw how Meech nearly made it across the finish line, didn't. And Charlottetown, at the same time, we had a similar type of situation. So he was that kind of a person who didn't do things because they were popular. I think now we look back, especially on his role regarding apartheid, as being very significant and being actually quite novel for the rest of the world. He took on Reagan, he took on Thatcher, and he wasn't afraid to stand up to them. But for him, the most important relationship for a Canadian Prime Minister was getting along with the U.S. President, to defend our interests and to have influence in the rest of the world. Because if the rest of the world looks at Canada and they say the Canadian Prime Minister can talk to the U.S. President, it gives us more strength.
Well, and I know you wrote about that for La Presse earlier today, but even in that time when one talks about the criticism that Brian Mulroney took in his era, he was criticized for being too American, too close to the United States. But build on what you just said right now, just how actually important that was for the type of country we are now.
Well, the biggest Canadian, the biggest partner, economically speaking, is with the United States. We're allies, we're partners, we're friends, and we're neighbors. So that relationship's important, and I think whoever wins the election in the United States next November, the Canadian Prime Minister has to have a dialogue, has to have connections. And it can't just only be between the personalities. It has to be a diplomatic way as well, through the embassies, through the councils, through the Quebec Delegate General in particular, who serve in the United States. There's 10 offices. So it's very important to keep a dialogue. And yes, people who wanted to be critical article about Mr. Mulroney. They said he was too close to the United States. But he stood up to Ronald Reagan on apartheid. He stood up to Ronald Reagan on some last-minute changes to the free trade agreement. And he was able to bring the free trade agreement, including Mexico, across the finish line as well. It was signed ultimately by Mr. Chrétien and Mr. Clinton, but 90% of the work was done by Brian Mulroney and George H.W. Bush.
Mm-hmm. You bring the politics of then to the politics of now, and that makes me wonder about what lessons do you think current politicians can learn from Brian Mulroney?
Dialogue, never treating your adversary as an enemy, and trying to find ways of finding solutions to problems. And sometimes you can't win it all. Sometimes you have to lose a bit. You have to pull back. But he was always ready to extend a hand. And I think he'll be remembered very much for that.
John Parisella, always appreciate our conversations. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, Michael. All the best.